Hello, welcome to Phantom Homicide. Today we are diving deep into the sinister history, controversies, and ultimate forensic truth surrounding one of America's most feared criminal figures, Albert DeSalvo, the man known as the Boston Strangler.
Right. And for you listening, that name, Albert DeSalvo, it just immediately brings back this time of absolute terror that gripped an entire city. We're talking Greater Boston between, June 62 and January 64?
Yeah, 13 women, single women.
Murdered.
13.
And the victims, the profiles were all over the place, weren't they? Teenagers, women in their 80s. It was baffling.
It absolutely was. And this wasn't just some crime wave the police were dealing with. It really shook the feeling of safety, especially in a big city. It left this lasting scar.
Real cultural trauma, yeah. Because the way people lived, especially women, it changed overnight.
And the story of the Strangler itself is, well, it's unusual. It's defined less by hard evidence, at least for decades, and more by this huge, dramatic confession.
The confession.
Yeah.
It gave everyone this neat solution, didn't it? People wanted it to be one guy. They needed that closure.
Yeah.
But even with the confession, doubts just lingered for years and years.
Exactly. So that's our mission today, really. We need to unpack all the sources we have on DeSalvo, look at his background, which is incredibly dark, track how he first got arrested.
For other crimes initially.
Right, for other crimes. Then dig into that confession, how it happened, why it was believed, why it was doubted, and then finally confront the DNA evidence, the science that came in, 50 years later?
Half a century. It's incredible. And that DNA, it changes the game, but maybe not in the way everyone expected.
That's the core of it, isn't it? What does the forensic truth actually tell us? And what mysteries, what sort of shadows are still hanging over this whole thing?
It's just so complex.
Yeah.
Because you have this incredibly detailed confession, right? DeSalvo knew things the public didn't know. But then there was basically zero physical evidence linking him back then. None of the usual stuff.
Fingerprints, witnesses placing him there, nothing concrete for the murders themselves.
Exactly. So we have to walk through all that confusion, the investigation mess, the legal battles, before we get to 2013, that moment when technology finally steps in and says, okay, scientifically, Albert DeSalvo was involved.
At least.
At least in one of the murders.
Yeah.
And that at least is huge. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The man himself. To really try and understand something like DeSalvo, you have to look at where he came from. Albert Henry DeSalvo, born in Chelsea, Massachusetts, September 3rd, 1931. And the sources, well, they paint a picture of his childhood that isn't just troubled. It's horrifying, almost like a textbook case for how violence gets ingrained.
Oh, absolutely. It's like reading a checklist for risk factors. He was one of 6 kids, right?
Yeah.
And the father, Frank DeSalvo, just unrelentingly violent, an alcoholic. And the abuse wasn't hidden away. It was constant, directed at the mother, at the kids. And the details are important, not just to be graphic, but for context.
Yeah.
We're talking about the father knocking out the mother's teeth, breaking her fingers right in front of the children. Albert saw this.
Imagine witnessing that level of sadism, that control.
Mm-hmm.
It warps everything.
And it wasn't just physical violence. There was this layer of sexual chaos and degradation, too.
Mm.
The sources say Frank would bring prostitutes home.
Right into the family home, engage in sex acts where the wife and kids could see. It's hard to even process that kind of environment. No safety, no boundaries, just violence, control, and women being treated as objects.
So the psychological damage, you can see how it laid the groundwork. Control issues, seeing sexual violence as normal.
It's almost inevitable, isn't it? And sure enough, his own path into crime starts incredibly young. The classic signs.
Torturing animals as a kid, that's always a huge red flag.
Huge. And then it escalates. Petty theft, shoplifting as a young teenager. It wasn't like he suddenly snapped. It was a gradual slide.
His first real run-in with the system was early, too, age 12.
12 years old, 1943. Arrested for battery and robbery. Sent off to the Lyman School for Boys.
Gets out, tries to work briefly, but then he's back again.
Yep, 1946. Auto theft this time. Back to Lyman. You see the pattern already. Commit crime, get caught, do time, get out, repeat. Recidivism.
But here's where it gets strange, a real paradox. Despite this background, he joins the Army.
And not only joins, but serves honorably his first time around. Re-enlists, even becomes a military police sergeant.
An MP sergeant with the
Yeah.
14th Armored Cavalry Regiment. Now, he did face a court-martial at some point. The details are a bit murky, but he still got an honorable discharge after his second tour.
That MP experience.
Yeah.
You can't overstate how important that is. It gives him training, authority, a way to project confidence, make people trust him. That discipline, that ability to wear a uniform and seem legitimate.
He weaponized it later, didn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the key to his pre-Strangler attacks, the ones that earned him those nicknames before anyone knew the name DeSalvo in connection with murder.
Right, the Measuring Man and the Green Man. Tell us about those. How did they show his methods evolving?
Okay, so the Measuring Man phase, that's around 1960, 1961. This is all about deception, nonviolent intrusion. He'd pose as a talent scout, sometimes a modeling agent.
Right, talk his way into women's homes.
Exactly. Persuade them to let him take their measurements. It's creepy, it's invasive, it's clearly preying on their hopes or vanity, but it establishes his method, gaining entry through lies, building that false trust.
And then came the Green Man. A definite escalation.
Big escalation. This is 63, 64, called the Green Man because he often wore green work pants, maybe making him look like a handyman or a utility worker, someone non-threatening who might need access.
But these weren't just intrusions anymore.
No. This is where the sexual assaults start. Breaking in or talking his way in, and then attacking the women. This is the pattern that gets him caught.
Crucially, he gets caught for these rapes, the Green Man attacks, not the Strangler murders, which had actually stopped months before his arrest in late 64.
Correct. And his capture itself was almost frantic. October 27, 1964. 2 incidents in one day.
He tried to get into a house in Bridgewater first,
Right.
posing as a motorist with car trouble.
Yeah, but the homeowner, a guy named Richard Spruill, who ironically later became the police chief of Brockton, he got suspicious. He didn't buy the story.
And Sprouls actually fired a shotgun at him.
He did. DeSalvo had to run for it, literally dodging bullets. You'd think that would deter someone.
But no, later that same day.
He tries again. Different town, East Cambridge. Poses as a detective this time. Gets into a young woman's apartment.
Ties her up, assaults her, but then does something really bizarre.
Totally unpredictable. He suddenly stops, unties her, says he's sorry, and just leaves.
Wow.
But that victim gave a fantastic description of the fake detective. That description was the key. It circulated, police put it together, and that's how they finally identified and arrested Albert DeSalvo for the Green Man rapes, the Strangler connection that would come later from inside the system.
Okay, so DeSalvo's arrested in late 64 for the Green Man rapes. But the city, Boston, had already lived through almost 2 years of sheer terror. The Boston Strangler murders had actually stopped about 10 months before his arrest.
That period, June 62 to January 64. It's hard to overstate the panic. 13 women, single women, murdered across the Boston area. The scale of it.
And the media naturally was all over it. They had names for the killer before Boston Stranglers stuck.
Oh, yeah. The Mad Strangler of Boston, Phantom Fiend, Phantom Strangler. The phantom part came from that terrifying detail.
No forced entry.
Almost never. It meant the victims likely let him in, willingly opened their doors, which implies what? Deception. Or maybe they knew him. That uncertainty was paralyzing.
It was 2 reporters, wasn't it? Gene Cole and Loretta McLaughlin from the Record American. They wrote a big series, and that's where the name The Boston Strangler really took hold.
That's right. It became the name everyone knew. But beneath that single name, when you look closer at the victims, at how they were killed, that's where the big problems start, the inconsistencies.
This is the core issue, right? The thing that fueled doubt for decades. The victim profile wasn't consistent at all.
Not even close. Look at the timeline. The first phase, mostly in 1962, the victims were predominantly older women, single, living alone. We're talking ages like 55 up to 85.
Anna Slister's 55, Mary Mullen 85. That's a huge age gap already.
Huge. And one of those early victims, the sources suggest she might have actually died from a heart attack during the assault, not even directly strangled in the same way. That's messy, disorganized almost.
Most serial killers have a very specific type, don't they? Age, appearance, lifestyle.
Usually very narrow. But then look at the second phase, late 62 into early 64. Suddenly the victims are much younger.
Ages 19 to 26. Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Joan Graff. Young women just starting their lives.
So you go from women born in the 1870s and 80s to women born in the 1940s, behaviorally. That's incredibly hard to square with a single killer. Experts just looked at that and said, wait a minute.
And it wasn't just the victims. The modus operandi, the MO, was inconsistent too.
All over the place. Okay, the common thread was sexual assault and strangulation, often with ligatures made from their own clothes, stockings, scarves, that kind of thing.
Which is terrifyingly intimate.
Deeply. But then, 2 victims were stabbed. Not strangled, stabbed to death. and another was badly beaten. Why the change? Why the different methods if it's one person refining their technique?
It just doesn't fit the standard profile. It screams multiple killers to anyone looking at the patterns.
Exactly. That became the defense argument later, and the source of so much public doubt.
But despite those inconsistencies, there was something linking these crimes, wasn't there? A kind of psychological signature.
Yes, there was. Even with the variations, there were these chilling ritualistic elements. The way the ligatures were often tied this distinctive bow, usually placed right under the chin. Very precise, very deliberate.
Almost neat.
Disturbingly so. And sometimes the positioning of the body, sexually degrading, symbolic. It felt like the killer was leaving a mark, asserting dominance beyond just the act of killing. It was psychological warfare.
So, Boston is terrified. How did law enforcement respond? It must have been chaos.
Utter chaos, especially at first. You had murders happening in different cities, different counties around Boston. Jurisdiction was a nightmare.
This is before easy coordination between departments, right?
Very much so.
Yep.
So the Massachusetts Attorney General, Edward W. Brooke, he did something pretty groundbreaking for the time. He formed a special multi-agency task force, the Strangler Bureau.
Trying to get everyone talking. Police from 5 cities, 3 counties.
Yeah, trying to pool resources, share information. It was one of the first big attempts at that kind of coordinated response to a serial killer crossing jurisdictional lines. Necessary, but probably pretty clumsy in practice back then.
And the pressure was immense, which led to some, questionable decisions.
Oh, definitely. Desperation makes people do strange things. Brooke actually allowed a parapsychologist, Peter Hurkos, to get involved. Claimed he had psychic powers, ESP.
You're kidding. They brought in a psychic?
They did. And Hurkos, with great fanfare, provided this minutely detailed description of completely the wrong person.
Oh, wow. That must have gone down well with the press.
About as well as you'd expect. Ridicule. It made the official investigation look even more lost, undermined public confidence when they needed it most.
Meanwhile, the city is just gripped by fear.
Absolutely paralyzed.
Yeah.
The media coverage was relentless, very graphic. Women, especially single women, felt like they were under siege.
People buying tear gas?
Tear gas, new locks, deadbolts, chains on their doors. These things became standard almost overnight. Some women just packed up and left the city altogether. It fundamentally changed how women felt about safety in their own homes in the city.
And then came the final murder. Mary Sullivan, January 4th, 1964.
Yeah, Mary Sullivan, only 19 years old. She represents the peak of the violence, the final act in this horrific sequence.
What happened in her case? Why does it stand out?
Well, the brutality was extreme, even by the Strangler standards. Raped and strangled in her apartment. The ritualistic elements were intense. 3 separate ligatures around her neck. A broom handle used internally. Just horrific violation.
And there was something else, wasn't there? A final message.
A calling card. Left leaning against her foot, a simple card that read, "Happy New Year."
Chilling, cold, calculated, and that was it. The last murder attributed to the Boston Strangler, and, as we now know, the only one we can definitively link to Albert DeSalvo. Okay, so fast forward again. 10 months after Mary Sullivan's murder, DeSalvo is arrested for the Green Man rapes. He's sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for evaluation. Police think he's a rapist, maybe disturbed, but he's not on their radar for the Strangler murders.
Not at all. The connection comes from inside Bridgewater. This is where the whole narrative takes a sharp, dramatic turn. DeSalvo starts talking to another inmate,
George Nassau.
George Nassar, a name that becomes almost as tangled up in this case as DeSalvo's. And DeSalvo confesses to Nassar, tells him he is the Boston Strangler.
And Nassar, who's already got connections, maybe sees an opportunity.
Seems likely. Nassar doesn't keep it to himself. He contacts his own lawyer, who happens to be
The already famous, very high-profile F. Lee Bailey.
Bingo. F. Lee Bailey. Known for taking on big, controversial cases, loves the spotlight, very aggressive defense attorney, Bailey takes DeSalvo on as a client.
And then DeSalvo starts confessing, officially.
In detail, he gives confessions under hypnosis first, induced by a Dr. William Joseph Bryan.
Hypnosis. That sounds shaky legally even then.
Very shaky. But he also gives detailed confessions without hypnosis in formal interviews with the Assistant Attorney General, John Bottomley.
What made these confessions so convincing? Why did police and, frankly, the public buy into it so readily?
Because he knew things. Specific details about the crime scenes that hadn't been released to the public. How furniture was arranged, what items were present, specific actions taken. Things only the killer or someone at the scene could possibly know.
It seemed undeniable.
It really did. And there was one detail in particular that apparently swayed F. Lee Bailey himself.
The blue chair.
The blue chair. DeSalvo's describing one of the crime scenes mentions a blue chair in the living room. But the victim in that case, who had survived an earlier encounter, had told police the chair was brown.
So a direct contradiction.
But then they checked the crime scene photos.
Hmm.
And the chair, it was blue. DeSalvo was right. The victim's memory was wrong. For Bailey, that was proof. Proof DeSalvo had actually been there.
Incredible detail, but even with these confessions, he was never actually charged with the murders.
Never. Not one of the 13 Strangler murders. And this is crucial for listeners to understand, because back then a confession alone wasn't enough for a murder charge, especially a capital one. You needed corroborating physical evidence.
And they didn't have it. No fingerprints, no DNA linking him directly to those murder scenes?
Exactly. So legally, they could only try him for the crimes they could prove he committed, the Green Man rapes and assaults. He confessed to being perhaps America's most notorious serial killer, but faced trial only as a serial rapist.
So what was Bailey's strategy? If he couldn't be tried for the murders, why bring the confessions up at all?
It was a gamble, a very controversial legal strategy. Bailey decided to introduce the Strangler confessions during DeSalvo's trial for the rapes.
Wait, how would that help?
The goal wasn't to get him acquitted of the rapes. It was to avoid the death penalty, which was still a possibility for some crimes, and more broadly, to argue for an insanity defense. Bailey wanted to paint DeSalvo as profoundly mentally ill, driven by uncontrollable urges rooted in his horrific childhood.
So use the Strangler confession as proof of insanity. This man is so sick, he did these things, therefore he wasn't responsible for his actions in the rapes either.
Essentially, yes. Argue that he belonged in a mental institution for study and treatment, not prison or the electric chair. They brought in experts like Dr. Harry Kozol, a respected neurologist who had actually set up the first sex offender treatment center in Mass. He evaluated DeSalvo.
How did that play out in court?
The jury didn't fully buy the insanity defense based on the Strangler confession for the rape charges. In 1967, DeSalvo was convicted for the rapes and assaults, the Green Man crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison.
Not a mental hospital.
No, life in prison. Bailey was reportedly furious. He argued society lost a chance to study the mind of a serial killer, potentially preventing future crimes. But DeSalvo was going to prison.
And that sentence, prison instead of Bridgewater, seems to have triggered his next dramatic move.
The escape. February 1967, just a month or so after his sentencing, he escapes from Bridgewater State Hospital along with 2 other inmates.
Chaos again. A massive manhunt across the state.
Huge. And interestingly, he left a note behind. Said he escaped to draw attention to the conditions at Bridgewater and his own situation. Always needing that attention, right?
It fits the profile, doesn't it? The need for notoriety.
It does. But the escape didn't last long, 3 days. He actually called Bailey, arranged to turn himself in, and was rearrested without incident in Lynn, Mass.
What were the consequences of the escape?
Big ones. He was deemed too risky for Bridgewater. They transferred him to Walpole State Prison, maximum security. And it's there, in Walpole, that he does something crucial.
He recants.
He recants, takes back all his Boston Strangler confessions, says he made it all up.
Why? The legal pressure was off, right? He wasn't facing the death penalty anymore.
Exactly. Once the strategic value of the confession, avoiding execution, maybe getting into a hospital, was gone, the confession itself seemed to evaporate. For the doubters, this just confirmed their suspicions. The confession was never real in the first place. It just deepened the mystery.
So DeSalvo recants, and that just pours fuel on the fire of doubt that had been smoldering all along, right? Even with that detailed confession, the whole case felt aloft to a lot of people.
Deeply off. The central controversy, the idea that never really went away, was that Boston wasn't terrorized by one man, but by several killers, maybe operating independently, whose crimes got lumped together under this single terrifying media label, the Boston Strangler.
And that theory isn't just speculation. It's rooted in the evidence, or lack thereof, and behavioral science.
Absolutely. People who knew DeSalvo personally, even some investigators, just couldn't reconcile the man they knew, the deceptive measuring man, the sometimes apologetic Green Man, with the savage ritualistic violence seen in some of the Strangler murders.
And the sheer inconsistency we talked about. The victims aged 19 to 85, different social backgrounds, different ethnicities, and the changing methods: strangling, stabbing, beating.
It's the core problem for profiling. The sources mention Robert Ressler, one of the FBI guys who basically invented modern serial killer profiling. He looked at the case files and was blunt. He said putting all those different patterns onto one individual was inconceivable behaviorally.
Inconceivable. That's a strong word from someone like Ressler.
Very strong. And other experts agreed. Susan Kelly, who got deep into the original Strangler Bureau files, argued forcefully that the evidence pointed to multiple killers.
And John Douglas, another big FBI profiler name.
Douglas had a fascinating take. He profiled DeSalvo based on the Green Man, rapes the crimes DeSalvo definitely committed. He saw DeSalvo as a power assurance rapist, meaning his motivation was about control, feeling powerful, getting confirmation of his dominance, but not necessarily about inflicting lethal violence or extreme sadism.
So Douglas thought DeSalvo was the Green Man rapist.
But probably not the Strangler, or at least not responsible for all the murders. But Douglas also noted DeSalvo fit the profile of someone who had falsely confessed to crimes like the Stranglers. Why?
That tremendous need for notoriety again.
Exactly. Taking credit for something huge, to feel important, to be somebody. It fit DeSalvo's psychology perfectly, according to Douglas. So maybe he confessed, but didn't actually do all of it.
That distinction is vital, isn't it? The psychology of the Green Man rapes versus the psychology needed for, say, the Mary Sullivan murder seems different. One is about control, the other seems more about rage, maybe ritual.
They often stem from different core motivations. And it wasn't just behavioral analysis casting doubt. There were concrete problems within the confession itself, especially when compared to the forensic details they did have.
Elaine Whitfield Sharp, the attorney for some of the families, she dug into this.
For years, she fought to get access to evidence and highlighted inconsistencies. Let's go back to Mary Sullivan's murder again, the last one.
DeSalvo confessed he strangled her with his bare hands.
Right. But the autopsy, the forensic evidence, clearly showed she was killed by ligature strangulation, something tied around her neck. That's a massive discrepancy. How could the killer get such a fundamental detail wrong?
And the time of death issue.
Another problem. Dr. Michael Baton, a very famous forensic pathologist, pointed out DeSalvo got the time of death wrong for Sullivan. And Susan Kelly found he was inaccurate about times of death in several other confessions, too.
What does that suggest?
It suggests he might be working off secondhand information, trying to piece together details he'd heard or read about, rather than having a clear first-hand memory of committing the crime. It smells like reconstruction, not recall.
And then there was that early semen analysis, the one that caused controversy for years.
Right. Professor James Starrs did an analysis back then, and his initial report found semen-like material on Sullivan's body, but concluded it did not match DeSalvo's blood type or other markers available at the time.
So for decades, there was this piece of forensic evidence, however preliminary, that seemed to actively exclude DeSalvo from the Sullivan crime scene.
Exactly. Now, we know 2013 DNA technology overturned that specific finding, but for 40-plus years, it was a huge point supporting the doubters. It fed directly into the suspicion around the confession's origins.
Which brings us back to George Nassar, the inmate DeSalvo confessed to.
The potential puppet master. Nassar was no petty criminal. He was serving life for murdering a gas station attendant. He was intelligent, manipulative.
And many people suspected he was the real Strangler, or one of them.
That theory was strong. Or, if not the killer himself, then the orchestrator. The idea was Nassar, maybe through his lawyer Bailey, got access to police reports or media details the public didn't know. Details about the crime scenes.
And then he fed those details to DeSalvo.
Fed them to DeSalvo, coached him. DeSalvo, desperate for fame, maybe easily led, repeats these details in his confession, making it sound authentic.
What was in it for Nassar and DeSalvo besides notoriety?
Maybe splitting reward money. There was reward money offered for solving the Strangler case. The theory went that Nassar and DeSalvo had a deal. DeSalvo confesses, becomes famous, and any money goes to support DeSalvo's wife and kids. It gives DeSalvo a very practical, understandable motive to lie, beyond just psychological needs.
Was there any psychiatric backing for this theory?
Oh, yeah. Dr. Ames Roby, the psychiatrist who evaluated both men at Bridgewater. He was scathing about Nassar, called him a misogynistic, psychopathic killer.
Wow.
And Roby testified that Nassar was a far more likely suspect for the Strangler murders than DeSalvo. He explicitly said, Albert so badly wanted to be the Strangler, implying he was psychologically primed for Nassar to manipulate him.
Did Nassar ever admit anything?
No, he always denied it. In '99, he complained the speculation ruined his parole chances. But the suspicion, the idea of Nassar pulling the strings or being the real killer hiding behind DeSalvo, that shadow hung over the case right up until the DNA results.
Okay, so for 50 years, this is where the case sat. Stuck. You had the confession riddled with doubts. You had behavioral profiles pointing away from DeSalvo for many of the crimes. You had the Nassar theory. No definitive physical proof either way for the murders, just ambiguity.
A half-century of ambiguity. A convicted rapist's word later recanted versus a psychopath's potential manipulation. Felt like an unsolvable knot, until technology caught up.
The game changer. DNA analysis. Techniques developed decades after the murders finally allowed investigators to go back to the preserved evidence from 1964.
Specifically, the evidence from Mary Sullivan's crime scene. They had preserved biological samples, including seminal fluid found on her body and on a blanket. Stuff that was useless in '64 could now potentially yield a definitive answer.
And in 2013, they got one. July 11th, Boston police announced a major development.
A huge development. They'd managed to extract a DNA profile from that decades-old seminal fluid. And they compared it not directly to DeSalvo initially, but using Y-DNA analysis.
Explain Y-DNA for us. How does that work?
Right, so Y-DNA is passed down virtually unchanged from father to son through the male line. All men in the same direct paternal lineage will share the same Y-DNA profile. DeSalvo himself was dead, obviously, and his DNA wasn't in any system from his lifetime.
Because they couldn't test him directly at first.
Correct. So they did the next best thing. They obtained a Y-DNA sample from one of DeSalvo's nephews, and they compared the nephew's Y-DNA to the Y-DNA profile from the crime scene semen. It was a match, a familial match. It proved conclusively that the semen found at Mary Sullivan's murder scene came from someone in Albert DeSalvo's direct male line.
That's huge. Even without a direct match to Albert yet, that narrows it down incredibly.
Staggeringly. The statistics were overwhelming. That Y-DNA match excluded something like 99.9% of all other men. It pointed the finger squarely at the DeSalvo family line.
So that gave them the justification they needed for the final step.
The final, conclusive step. They got court authorization to exhume Albert DeSalvo's body from the Peabody Cemetery where he was buried.
Must have been a massive media event.
Oh, absolutely, after 50 years. So they exhumed him, took a direct DNA sample from his remains, and just over a week later, July 19, 2013, they announced the result.
The direct match.
An exact match. The DNA from Albert DeSalvo's remains was identical to the DNA profile from the seminal fluid recovered at Mary Sullivan's murder scene in 1964.
No more ambiguity.
None whatsoever. The district attorney, Daniel Connolly, said it left no doubt that Albert DeSalvo was responsible for the brutal murder of Mary Sullivan. Scientifically proven.
For Mary Sullivan's family after 50 years? That must have been, I can't even imagine. Finally, some measure of definitive truth for her murder.
A profound moment of closure for them, absolutely. The science finally provided the answer that the legal system couldn't deliver 50 years earlier. It proved DeSalvo wasn't just a confessor. He was, in fact, a rapist and a killer.
But, and this is the crucial but, isn't it?
This is the essential caveat. The DNA definitively links Albert DeSalvo to one murder, Mary Sullivan's. The final murder attributed to the Strangler.
It does not prove he committed the other 12 murders.
It absolutely does not. It confirms he killed Sullivan. It lends credibility, perhaps, to parts of his confession relating to her murder. But for the other 12 victims, the older woman, the ones who were stabbed, the ones whose cases had those behavioral inconsistencies, the DNA tells us nothing new.
So the multiple killer theories, they're still plausible.
They remain entirely plausible. The DNA solves the Sullivan case definitively. But it leaves the mystery surrounding the other 12 victims largely intact. We know DeSalvo killed the last victim. Was he also responsible for some or all of the others despite the inconsistencies? Or were there other predators stalking Boston during that time whose crimes got swept under the same infamous label? The DNA doesn't answer that.
So we have a killer confirmed for the final act. But the identity of the Boston Strangler as the perpetrator of all 13, that remains fragmented, unproven, still shrouded in that historical doubt. And long before the DNA provided that partial clarity, Albert DeSalvo himself met a violent end. His own story didn't conclude with a peaceful death in prison.
No, not at all. November 25, 1973. He's 42 years old, serving his life sentence at Walpole Maximum Security. He's found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary.
Another layer of violence and mystery. Was his murder ever solved?
Officially, no. A man named Robert Wilson, who had ties to the Winter Hill Gang, Whitey Bulger's outfit, was actually tried for DeSalvo's murder. But the trial resulted in a hung jury, no conviction.
So it remains unsolved. What were the theories about why he was killed?
Well, there were a couple of prominent ones, reflecting the grim realities of prison life. F. Lee Bailey, his former lawyer, suggested it was basically about prison economics.
Drugs.
Amphetamines. Bailey claimed DeSalvo was dealing drugs inside Walpole, but undercutting the prices set by the established inmate syndicate. So he was killed for messing with their business, a purely transactional prison hit.
That sounds grimly plausible.
It does. But there was always the other theory, the one directly connected back to the Strangler case itself.
That he was silenced.
Exactly. Killed to stop him from talking. Maybe he was about to recant his recantation. Or maybe he was about to finally expose the truth about the other murders, maybe name Nassar, or other accomplices if there were any. Killing him ensured whatever secrets he held died with him. It conveniently cemented the narrative around his confession, perhaps.
We'll likely never know the real reason for his death. But the case itself, the whole Boston Strangler saga, it left a huge legacy, didn't it? It changed things.
Profoundly. In law enforcement, for instance. That chaotic investigation, the jurisdictional nightmares, it really drove home the need for better cooperation. The Strangler Bureau, despite its flaws, was an early model for the multi-agency task forces that are standard procedure now for major serial cases.
And it pushed forward criminal profiling.
Right. Massively. It was a harsh lesson that investigators couldn't just rely on physical evidence, especially when dealing with seemingly random motiveless crimes. They needed to understand the psychology, the behavior, the patterns. The Strangler case was foundational for the FBI's behavioral science unit and the whole field of profiling.
Legally, too, it's often cited as a prime example of
The unreliability of confessions without solid physical evidence, especially confessions given under pressure or by people seeking fame. DeSalvo's case highlighted that gap for decades, until the DNA finally provided that missing physical link for at least one crime.
And just in society, the fear it generated had lasting effects.
Absolutely. It sparked intense conversations about women's safety, particularly in cities. Stranger danger took on a whole new, terrifying meaning. And the practical things, people installing better locks, deadbolts, peepholes that became the norm in urban apartment living, partly because of the climate of fear the Strangler created.
And culturally, the case just exploded. It became this huge, almost mythical story.
Instantly recognizable worldwide. Books, documentaries, movies. It captured the public imagination, often in ways that weren't entirely accurate.
Like the 1968 movie The Boston Strangler, with Tony Curtis as DeSalvo.
Right, a famous film, but very sensationalized. It wrongly depicted DeSalvo as having multiple personality disorder, which he was never diagnosed with. It shaped the public perception, but not always accurately.
There was a more recent film, too, wasn't there? Focused on the reporters.
Yeah, the 2023 film Boston Strangler, telling the story more from the perspective of Loretta McLaughlin, one of the journalists who broke the story and coined the name. It highlighted how much the media narrative shaped the entire event.
And then there's that bizarre, almost unbelievable footnote from the Texas legislature.
Oh, the 1971 April Fool's joke. It's incredible. A state representative, wanting to prove that the legislature passed bills without reading them, submitted a resolution commending Albert DeSalvo.
Commending him for what?
For his work in population control. It was meant as a morbid, cynical joke. And guess what?
They passed it?
Unanimously. They had to retract it later, obviously, but it just shows how embedded the Strangler name, the notoriety was in popular culture, even used for political stunts. Hashtag outro. So, at the end of the day, where does this leave us? The DNA finally provided that piece of legal closure, that certainty, for Mary Sullivan and her family. It proved DeSalvo was a killer. But that historical certainty, it's still fractured, isn't it?
Yeah.
The mystery around the other 12 victims, the question of whether it was truly one man or several, that ambiguity persists. It continues to challenge investigators, historians, anyone trying to understand what really happened during those terrifying years in Boston.
Right. It leaves us with this tension. We have forensic proof for one piece of the puzzle, maybe the final piece. But does DeSalvo's confirmed guilt in that one horrific murder act like a key that unlocks the entire case? Does it mean we can comfortably say, oh, okay, he did them all, despite all the contradictory evidence of the behavioral impossibilities?
Or do we have to accept something potentially more disturbing?
Exactly. Does the evidence force us to consider the terrifying possibility that Boston wasn't haunted by a single strangler, but perhaps by multiple predators operating under this one infamous banner created by fear in the media? Was the Boston Strangler a man, or was it a phenomenon?
A chilling thought to leave things on.
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussions, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.